We are here today for another very important lecture. You would have recently seen in the news about meeting of Prime Minister Modi with Russian President and followed by his visit to Austria, which has been watched by different countries differently. The West is seeing it differently, China is seeing differently, our people are seeing it differently. But that notwithstanding, what is the truth that India is being watched? And therefore, it is not that in all our interactions, we look as to how it is going to assist us or assist our national interests. But it is also important how the others are benefiting because they will also join us only, if their national interest and requirements are met. So today we will not be going far off from India. We will be looking towards the countries which are closer to our landmass, and basically we shall look at South Asian countries as to how they fitting in the India's grand strategy, in the evolution, the way we are, growing, and even if we have not stated what are our unsaid ambitions for future, whether we look at 2047 or we couldn't have got a better person than Professor Jacob, who is the founder director of CSDR and a renowned professor of GNU, to speak on this particular subject. I'm also grateful to him for having spared his time for us, and I'm sure each one of us will benefit immensely from this. I would now request Wing Commander Vishal Jain to introduce the speaker, and thereafter we shall request Professor Jacob to take the stage.
Good morning to all. Dr. Happymon Jacob is a New Delhi-based academic, columnist, and commentator. He's an associate professor of diplomacy and disarmament at the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Prior to joining JNU in 2008, he held teaching positions at the University of Jammu and J&K and Jamia Millia Islamia University, New Delhi, and research positions at the Center for Air Power Studies, Delhi Policy Group, and Observer Research Foundation. Dr. Jacob is an elected member of the Pugwash Council since 2013. He is the author of Line of Fire, Ceasefire Violations and India-Pakistan Escalation Dynamics, published by Oxford University Press in 2019, and Line of Control, Traveling with the Indian and Pakistani Armies, published by Penguin Viking 2018. His concurrent engagements with the Indian media include a column with the Hindu and hosting of a weekly video show on national security on the Wire India. He's passionate about breaking down the walls between policy and scholarship and bringing together academia and practice.
Thank you so much for this invitation, General Ashokji. It's a pleasure to sort of come to the Institute, and I'm delighted to see that you organize this important lectures, notwithstanding mine is not important, but, and delighted that you could give me an opportunity to come to talk to scholars and speak to those who are joining us online. What I'm going to do today is to tell you something that is somewhat counterintuitive. The argument that we generally hear is that India must redouble its efforts in South Asia to get South Asia back from China. I'm going to argue that's a bad idea. I'm going to say that the concept of South Asia no longer works for India's grand strategy. We must think beyond the artificial construct of South Asia and reimagine our grand strategy. There are 3 or 4 ways I think South Asia constrains India's grand strategy. The first way in which it limits India's grand strategy is because South Asia as a construct limits India's region into India and its small neighbors, boxed in a fight with Pakistan, balanced by its small states, and increasingly dominated by China. The geographical smallness of South Asia creates a psychological constraint on our politicians, on our thinkers, on our bureaucrats, our strategic elite, our decision makers when it comes to India's region. If you are seeing your region as South Asia, India is a huge country. And if you think your neighborhood is South Asia, then you're thinking so. Once we willingly accept the mental barrier of South Asia as your region, then we are limiting ourselves and our imagination. My argument is that we should break out of that self-created mental barrier, as it were. The third way in which South Asia constrains India's regional strategy is that India looks at the regions beyond South Asia as India's extended neighborhood, which do not naturally belong to India's neighborhood. Is West Asia extended neighborhood or neighborhood? If you ask me, I would say West Asia is our neighborhood. The Indian Ocean region is our neighborhood. We don't usually hear an Indian Ocean region or West Asia as our neighborhood. We usually hear them as our extended neighborhood. That's wrong framing, if you ask me. Now, finally, South Asia is no longer India-centric, thanks to the arrival of China. So the current Indian attempt seems to be that win South Asia back from China. What are we doing by doing that? We are, by trying to retake South Asia from China, India is playing a losing game. And in an already shrunken strategic theater. Okay, these are my initial remarks. Now let me come to what I am saying, why I am saying what I am saying. First of all, what is South Asia? South Asia is an imagined community, like many of you have read about imagined communities by Anderson. The modern day South Asian geography existed for millennia. There's no doubt about that. But where does the word or the phrase South Asia come from? Phraseology of South Asia, the phrase called South Asia is very new. There was no mention of South Asia during the colonial period. The British never mentioned South Asia. British India, for them, summed up the region, right? Till Afghanistan, it was British India. So for them, British India meant the entire region. There was no South Asia there. What happened after the British left? After the British left, it became Indian subcontinent. Again, no South Asia. So in the 1950s, 1960s, nobody was talking about South Asia. We're talking about Indian subcontinent. The view of India being a legatee state of the British Empire was very strong in the Indian independent, post-independent Indian bureaucracy and the political establishment. So the Indian bureaucracy and the political establishment followed many of the policies that were being followed by the British Empire towards the region. That is the prehistory of South Asia. So even in the 1950s, when Jawaharlal Nehru started talking about India's relationship with the world, he never mentioned South Asia. If you actually look at Nehru's writings, Nehru's speeches, glimpses of world history, there is no mention of South Asia. There is a mention of Asia. There is a mention of India and the Asian unity, that is and the other. It's not South Asia. So where does South Asia come? Why is this artificial coinage of South Asia dominating our strategic discourse today? The post-colonial Indian subcontinent became South Asia when the United States State Department policy documents and articulations started mentioning the phrase South Asia. So that's a new phenomenon, maybe in the 1960s, maybe in the 1970s. Once the American State Department started, once the American State Department started talking about South Asia, then various university departments around the world, in Germany, in the United States, in the UK, started picking up this particular framing of the region. So you have the State Department, you have university departments, and now you have research departments or research institutions in various parts of the world, again starting to talk about South Asia. So in other words, a term handed down by the US State Department, embraced by international organizations, including the UN organizations and university departments around the world. South Asia became, or South Asia is a product of a top-down intellectual process. It is not a dynamic, bottom-up, organic signifier at all. I think that history is to be kept in mind. One of the reasons why India's neighbors liked the term South Asia is because there is a certain political neutrality to that term. When you think of Indian subcontinent, there is an inherent pro-India bias or Indian centrality to Indian subcontinent. When you mention South Asia, it's a neutral phraseology. So India's neighbors also liked the phrasing South Asia. But if you actually take India out of South Asia, there is no South Asia. Every South Asian country shares a border with India and not with each other, except Afghanistan and Pakistan. So if you take India out of South Asia, there is no South Asia. So India is at the heart of South Asia. India provides meaning to South Asia, except today, when China has come into South Asia in a very predominant manner. So China's arrival in South Asia in some ways has complicated Indian centrality for India in South Asia. So for a long time, India did not really bother with the phraseology called South Asia. India was not really concerned about how the neighbors viewed India or India's policy in the region, what people were framing the region as. And they did not bother because Indian centrality was so huge. But today, that centrality has become challenged in many ways. Now, let me also tell you why South Asian regionalism, or SAARC and its associated initiatives and institutions, did not make much sense for India. The existential centrality of South Asia is so huge that regionalism makes, or regional institutions make, no sense for India. Why is that? Because South Asian regionalism cannot contribute to or cannot add to India's prominence or stakes or centrality in South Asia. On the contrary, South Asian regionalism can actually damage or reduce India's centrality in South Asia. That is why India likes to deal with South Asian countries one by one, bilaterally, and not in a common, joint fashion, in a multilateral fashion. Because the moment multilateralism comes, it weakens India's predominance in the region. Therefore, historically, India has only, I would argue, at best tolerated South Asian regionalism, has not really actively promoted it. Every government in India, I mean, you had in the mid-1980s SAR coming into existence, you have several governments after that, various political parties. All of them, in some ways, intuitively looked at South Asian regionalism and said, this some ways damages or undercuts our predominance in the region. Now, it's not just the governments. Indians intuitively have an understanding of South Asia as holding India back. If you look at the 450-odd middle-class Indians, and if you ask, do you feel South Asian? What will be the answer? The answer is likely to be, we don't feel South Asian, we feel Indian. We don't feel South Asia as providing any meaning or identity to our existence. So they feel nothing common with the rest of South Asia, the Indian Middle East. They feel more common with the Americans and with the Germans and with the United Kingdom and with Western countries in general, not with South Asia. So for a huge aspirational and upwardly mobile Indian middle class with growing opportunities around the world, South Asia is insignificant for a lot of Indians. I'm not being disparaging in my sort of comments. I'm being analytical. I'm simply trying to sort of tell you how I see India's relationship with South Asia. I'm not being disrespectful towards our neighbors. That's not the objective here. Now, if you look at the Indian strategic elite, that was the middle class. Look at the Indian strategic elite. The Indian strategic elite has always believed that South Asia is a millstone around India's neck. South Asia actually constrains India's strategic possibilities. It does not enhance India's strategic possibilities. So, if you ask the Indian strategic elite, which is people here, in my opinion, they would say that being treated on par with other South Asian countries is a snub to India. India is too big to be treated on par with the other South Asian countries. And yet, we continue to use the framing called South Asia. South Asia continues to dominate our strategic imagination of the region. You see the contradiction. So, let's come to the China question a bit. What is China in South Asia? Until about 15 years ago or 20 years ago at best, China was not interested in South Asia. Where was China interested? China's primary region is Southeast Asia. So China was focused on Southeast Asia, interested in Southeast Asia, was trying to build its empire of influence in Southeast Asia. In the last 15 to 20 years, China has now come into the South Asian region. It is a non-resident power in South Asia. So China is a non-resident power. What do I mean by that? China is a non-resident power because it has no cultural, political, religious, linguistic ties with South Asia. India has all of these with South Asia, and that complicates our relationship with ours. China can come in, do its business, have its strategic partnerships, and get going. How many South Asian refugees live in China, as opposed to how many live in India, for that matter? So you see the fact that they are a non-resident power. China's rise in South Asia, in some ways, has, in many ways, undercut many of India's long-held assumptions about South Asia. Two main assumptions. Number one, that the small South Asian countries have no option but to strategically depend on India. That has been the Indian belief. And it worked for a very long time. In 2004, 2002, or 2004, when the Elephant Pass crisis was happening in Sri Lanka, the Sri Lankans asked India for weapons. The Indian side said, we will give you weapons, don't buy it from anywhere else, but we will give you defensive weapons. This is a sovereign country asking you for weapons, and you tell them, this is the language we use. I'm not blaming that language, I'm simply framing it and saying that is because India thought they had no other place to go to. They were dependent on India. Assumption number one. China has dismantled that assumption. China says, we are here. You can use us to balance India. The second assumption, the Indian assumption has been that because of the cultural, religious, ethnic, linguistic linkages that India has with these smaller countries, we will have a fantastic relationship with these countries. These relationships will somehow promote India's strategic interests in the region. If you look at that assumption, in my opinion, that assumption has also become demythified in many ways. If there is one country with which India has a lot of cultural linkage, which is Pakistan, what is the state of play between India and Pakistan? Or for that matter, Bangladesh or Nepal, any other country. In fact, the cultural and other soft power linkages have become a problem in some ways, rather than we have been in a position to use that to our advantage. So the South Asia framing, as far as our strategic priorities in the region, or as far as our strategic understanding of the region is concerned, South Asia framing is a problem, also because of the arrival of China. China is saying, South Asia is mine too. South Asia is my neighborhood too. So India's ability to dominate, monopolize the South Asian space has been dismantled by China. South Asian states have other options to balance. So my point simply is that therefore, our framing of South Asia as our primary region is actually undercutting our own strategic priorities and our own grand strategy, regional grand strategy in many ways. Let me come to the question of, I have some more time, right?
Yes.
Let me come to the question of South Asia as a concept. We talked about the historical origins of South Asia, India's place in South Asia, India's framing of South Asia as its strategic, as a region of strategic importance. South Asia is also a geopolitically diminishing concept. It is imploding internally and expanding externally. What do I mean by that? Imploding internally. SARC is ineffective. There is very little intra-regional trade that happens in South Asia compared to ASEAN or some other regions. The emotional connect that we keep talking about, India and Bangladesh, India and Pakistan, India and Nepal, the emotional connect that we keep talking about is declining, particularly among the younger population. How many Indians travel to Nepal? How many Nepalese come to India for tourism or visit? How many Indians have friends in Pakistan? I don't know to answer that question. Or how many Indians go to, say, Bangladesh for tourism or visit? The linkages that other regions have among themselves, we just don't have that with our South Asian countries. If you go to today's Pakistan or Bangladesh and say, hey, we are all, at the end of the day, we are one big country, we are one big region, we work together at some point of time history. They will say, wait a minute, we are proud Pakistanis, we are proud Bangladesh, we are proud Nepalese. Treat us like an independent country. We don't want to do anything emotional and cultural and all of that. That's all part of stock business. So there is no emotional connect. The real emotional connect, if you ask me, that we are South Asians, the feeling of South Asian or the emotional connect among South Asians exists only in the South Asian diaspora abroad. 25, 30 million Indian, Bangladeshi, Pakistani, Sri Lankan, Nepali diaspora in the Middle East or in other places, parts of the world. When they come together, when they meet abroad, a lot of bhaichara there. There's a lot of hugging and talking about Bollywood and that music within South Asia. That doesn't happen in South Asia. It happens elsewhere. What happens elsewhere is not an indication of regionalism in South Asia, right? As I said, travel. There is no travel. Travel that's happening within South Asia by South Asians. The younger South Asians are looking at Middle East, East Asia, West or the United States for business, tourism, education, even cultural connections. Where do South Asians go for education? There was a time when Nepalese and Bangladeshis and Afghans used to come to India for education. No longer, a lot of them are actually going to China for education. We don't even allow Afghans to come to India for education. I'm simply describing it. So, not that South Asians earlier traveled a lot to other South Asian countries. Even 20 years ago, 30 years ago, they did not really travel, but they wanted to travel. This was a post-partisan generation. They wanted to travel, they could not travel. Today, they still can't travel, but they don't want to travel. If you ask me, do I want to go to Nepal or do I want to go to Germany? Probably say Germany. Do I want to go to Afghanistan or do I want to go to some other place? So that desire to be in South Asia, travel to South Asia, explore South Asia, that is completely disappearing. So that if the old ties that bind the region, South Asian region, they're weakening, and the younger South Asians have embraced the age of post-nostalgia. We have no nostalgia. Our parents probably used to have some nostalgia. I come from the South. My parents didn't have any nostalgia about partition or about Bangladesh or about Pakistan. None. But even if that existed in Punjab and other places, or in UP or Bihar, The younger generation, they have no such nostalgia about the past. The older ones have. So that is another reason why I think the forced framing of South Asia makes no sense even today. The region itself will disappear. The construct of South Asia, an intellectual construct of South Asia, as a cohesive idea, South Asia is disappearing. So why are we sticking to South Asia as a strategic concept for ourselves? So therefore, my argument is that India must think beyond South Asia. It is not how we should define our neighborhood as our primary region. In any case, the region, as I said, is expanding. Historically, if you look at it historically, it's only since 1947 has India's region become so small. Look at the times before 1947. Now, I'm not saying that I'm not an advocate of Akhand Bharat or any of that. That's not the argument here. I'm simply trying to define regions here. You look at the Maurya Empire or the Kushan Empire or the Gupta Empire or the Mughal Empire. All of these empires were far bigger than today's India. By that, it also meant that they defined their neighborhood very differently. South Asia was not the neighborhood. Even the Chola Empire, Southern Empire, had its presence in Southeast Asia. So, if South Asia is expanding, if the concept of South Asia is irrelevant, and if we are unnecessarily holding on to an artificial construct called South Asia, it's time, in my opinion, we put an end to it, and that the regional balance of power must also expand. Our idea of what is balance of power in the region must also expand. We can't be balancing within South Asia as if South Asia is a God-given natural construct as far as India's neighborhood is concerned. Why should India continue to try and maintain a balance of power in South Asia, whereas we should be talking about balance of power in Southern Asia or in Asia for that matter? The more you shrink in your mind the region, the smaller your approach to strategic matters become as far as your own strategic perceptions are concerned. I leave it at that.